What if the theory of evolution we've been carefully fed since childhood is only half true, or half a lie? Yes, looking at some Homo sapiens, you could almost believe people really did descend straight from apes. Not all of them, of course, but certain specimens definitely give that impression, and you've probably met a few in your own life. Not so long ago, there lived a well-known researcher who devoted himself to studying ancient civilizations and searching for answers to questions official science prefers to ignore. He captivated his audience so much that videos with his talk still get millions of views. His name is Andrey Sklyarov. In one old TV interview, he touched on the origin of humankind and, most intriguingly, backed up his opinion with facts that make you feel a little uneasy. Today, drawing on his work, we're going to look at a very unusual version of how Homo sapiens appeared on planet Earth. Try, just for a moment, to forget everything you were taught at school about man from ape. Imagine you're not holding a biology textbook, but a case file, numbers, facts, oddities, and one word on the cover, origin. The first thing that jumps out is this. Yes, we really are very similar to animals. DNA analysis shows we have about 95% of our genes in common with chimpanzees. That kind of overlap doesn't appear out of nowhere. On the molecular level, we're almost relatives. A human embryo in the womb goes through stages biologists know well from the animal world, and only then becomes the being we confidently call a child. Our blood doesn't give us much reason to act superior either. Our blood is compatible with apes. Transfusions have been done. Apes also have blood groups that match well with human ones. In other words, part of the animal world is our potential donor. If you zoom out to look at the remains of ancient organisms and the succession of species, you can see traces of development, increasing complexity of forms, growing diversity. All of this fits nicely into the evolutionary picture. And here, Sklyarov is completely fair. He doesn't tear down evolution just to sound provocative. He says plainly, the theory of evolution has the right to exist, but then he asks a question that rarely gets voiced. Is that theory enough to fully explain humans specifically? Not in broad strokes, but in the details where evolution, you'd think, should start to stumble.
This is where Darwin comes to mind. For a long time, while promoting his model of how species develop, he carefully sidestepped the topic of humans as if he were saving it for later. Only toward the end of his life, under the pressure of the relentless logic of his own theory, he was forced to say, yes, humans came from apes. At the same time, the researcher notes, he resisted this conclusion for quite a long time. It also matters what era he lived in. Back then, science was only just beginning to describe the world without constantly referring to the Old Testament. Before that, most scholars barely questioned the biblical picture of the world. It was treated as a given, not as one version among others. If you put religion aside and look only at the body, there are still things that don't fit neatly into this picture. Sklyarov doesn't argue about the height of human consciousness. He simply points out, animals are still far from fully studied, and any dog or cat owner knows their pet feels like an individual and knows how to express what it wants. Drawing a hard line that cuts humans off from the rest of the world on this basis would be too bold, so he suggests we look at something else. That something else is a set of oddities in our physical design that don't sit well with the logic of survival. The first of these is our hair. He admits, I often thought about hair. How fast does our hair grow? Very fast. If you never cut a child's hair, by the age of 5 or 6, they would literally be stepping on it. Exactly at the age when, in a primitive community, they were already supposed to be helping the adults. Now imagine that child in a real survival situation. Their hair gets tangled in branches, they trip over their own locks, they lose speed, they can't see what's happening under their feet. A creature that poorly adapted for survival simply could not have survived, yet it did, he emphasizes. You could say, well, that's just a mutation. But then the question becomes, when did it occur? After humanity had already invented knives and scissors? Even if we allow that, there's still another problem. How quickly would such an inconvenient mutation have to spread across the entire human population for long-growing hair to become the norm for almost everyone today? Fingernails also grow quickly, but they have a clear justification. They get worn down in daily work. Hair doesn't naturally wear down the same way. It has to be consciously cut, tied back, braided.
Archaeology adds another detail. In reconstructions of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, artists most often draw short, coarse manes down to the shoulders. But Inca mummies have been found with hair longer than the person's height, 1.5 times longer in fact. So at some point on Earth, there lived people whose hair grew just as ours does, and no one was cutting it naturally. This leads to a simple question. How do you reconcile the image of a wild ancestor with the need to systematically care for that kind of hair? You have to regularly braid it, tie it up, use cords and materials. That's no longer an animal existence of whatever happens, but deliberate self-care. And that's where you start to feel that the picture doesn't quite line up. From here, he shifts the focus from our appearance to our insides, to our genes. When scientists began seriously studying human DNA across the globe, they ran into another oddity. It turned out that the entire human population on the planet differs in its gene pool less than chimpanzees in a single troop, the researcher says. In other words, you and a person on the opposite side of the world are genetically closer to each other than several apes living side by side. To explain this, the mitochondrial-Eve hypothesis was proposed. At some point, our ancestors passed through a narrow bottleneck. Many lineages died out, and all the human diversity we see today comes from a very small group of survivors. Estimates put this tens of thousands of years ago, from 70 to 150,000 years. And some calculations shrink that group to just 20 or 30 individuals. In essence, this picture is very close in spirit to the image of one Adam and Eve. But even that is not the end of it. When you compare our genome with that of chimpanzees, of course, you find a number of differences, and that's expected. What's unexpected is something else. Sklyarov cites the data. About 90% of these differences fall into a region whose function we cannot determine. Moreover, this region has nothing in common with the known animal world. In other words, the main distinctions between us and our closest relatives are concentrated in a section of DNA about which science cannot yet confidently say what it does or why it is structured that way. Against this backdrop, it's tempting for many people to swing to the opposite extreme and say, fine, then we were simply created. But the researcher is very strict about that line of thinking. In his words, if we take the other extreme, creationism, then writing it off as creation means abandoning knowledge altogether. God wanted it that way. End of story. You can, he stresses, dump anything you like onto that formula. In fact, it's a confession of your own helplessness. At the same time, he reminds us the Old Testament didn't appear in a vacuum. Before it, there were other religions and worldviews. Different peoples had their own legends and stories about where humans came from. And if you step away from the scheme we're used to, you can see much older versions. One of them is found in Sumerian traditions. There, humans are described not simply as creations of the gods, but as the result of a specific process. In the interpretation of Zecharia Sitchin, which Sklyarov relies on, humans were created by a genetic method.
They took a local blank, an almost finished creature on Earth, and added to it the genes of certain gods, that is, representatives of another civilization. Essentially, we're talking about a hybrid of terrestrial and extraterrestrial. And this is where the details start to feel unsettling. Paradoxically, the way the Sumerians describe the details of this process in some places resembles modern ideas about genetic experiments, he says. On one side of the scale, we still have evolution, our kinship with animals, and the regular increase in complexity of life forms. On the other side, we have hair that gets in the way of survival, a bottleneck of 20 to 30 individuals, strange regions of DNA, and ancient texts describing the intervention of gods in the genetic code. Official science prefers to discuss only the first side of the scale, but if you look at the whole picture, you get the feeling that in the story of human origins, there is another layer, one that an ordinary biology textbook doesn't even begin to touch.
After a conversation about evolution, another tempting word appears: involution. Not from amoeba to human, but the opposite, a movement from top to bottom. For those who don't like strict creationism, but aren't satisfied with Darwinism either, it looks like a convenient third option. In its most extreme versions, everything boils down to one phrase: from human down to amoeba. In softer versions, the ape is not considered our ancestor, but a degenerated human. In theosophical schemes like Blavatsky's teachings, spiritual entities exist first, and then they descend into matter, and through a series of cycles condense into the dense physical world. On paper, the picture looks beautiful. Once there was a high starting point, and everything else is a fall. But if you look at nature, not a single version of involution finds support in the facts. Sklyarov, as a researcher, emphasizes there are no signs showing that at first everything was higher and better, and only then went downhill. If spiritual entities really descended from higher dimensions, there should be traces of this movement, transitional states, remnants of something half spiritual, half material. No such traces exist. Then he suggests we look at the idea of dimensions in an even simpler way. Suppose there are four-dimensional beings, different from us, the three-dimensional ones. By the same logic, there should also be two-dimensional and one-dimensional living beings. They would have to show up somewhere, at least as rare anomalies. In nature, we don't see them. Everything is three-dimensional. A theory that introduces extra levels but doesn't give a single testable consequence is just hanging in the air. The criterion for a serious theory, which Sklyarov insists, is simple. It must generate consequences that can be tested. And here, the comparison with evolution turns out to be harsh. Darwinian evolution stands on testability. In the geological layers, we see remains of organisms, increasing complexity of forms, and growing diversity. That is, we see observational confirmation of evolution. But we do not see any confirmation of involution at all.
Most creationist views are dualistic, the spiritual and the physical. The material is described using images of clay, blood, and so on. A human does not grow out of the world by himself, but is born by the will of the gods. There are many such pictures, but they are easily reduced to a few families. The first is classic Old Testament creationism, where humans are created by the decision of a single God. The second is broader theistic concepts, where there is also a higher mind and will, but not necessarily in biblical scenery. The key objection is the same. In the creationist version, everything rests on the formula, created by the will of God. It's not so important what exactly the human was molded from. What matters is that this act is taken out of the realm of physical laws from the start. Essentially, it is an event that, in principle, cannot be described by physical laws and, in the scientific sense, remains unknowable. From there, he moves to a more general theory of divine origin. As an example, he mentions Indian traditions where the world is seen as cyclical. God creates the universe, it exists, is destroyed, then everything starts again, and in each cycle, humans appear. Here, it's not a single event, but a reoccurring act, yet with the same initial conditions. There is a creative mind and will that do not obey the laws we know, and have personal qualities. This picture is conveniently called theism. It's not necessarily church dogma, but the idea of a personal creator who decides how the world is arranged. But here too, the origin of humans ends up in a realm where scientific methods are powerless. As a result, we see a fork in the road that Sklyarov outlines very clearly. Involution sounds impressive, but leaves no traces in nature. Creationism and theism give bright images, but move the key moment beyond the limits of knowledge. Evolution explains a lot, but as you've already heard, does not close every question. And the very fact that none of these lines gives a final answer only pushes us harder to look for versions that take into account both ancient texts and real biological data at the same time.
By the end of the 20th century, another line in the story of human origins is sounding louder, the extraterrestrial one. More and more often we hear, there is something off about humans on this planet. We break bones out of nowhere, on ice, on a step, in places where animals would simply slip and run on. For some researchers, this looks like a hint. Humans may be poorly adapted to Earth's gravity, as if our bodies were used to another, softer planet. A similar picture emerges in experiments with biorhythms. In conditions of complete isolation from external signals, plants and animals kept precise synchronization with Earth's 24-hour cycle. In humans, this inner pendulum drifts. Against this background, the cosmic version appears. Maybe we are not entirely native to this planet. If you look at the popular versions, human imagination then splits in different directions. In the simplest scenario, people say we are direct descendants of aliens who landed here in prehistoric times. In more complex schemes, hybrids appear, genetic experiments, evolution programs supposedly preloaded by an extraterrestrial mind. Sklyarov carefully filters out what cannot even be called a theory. He draws a clear line. A theory is not just a pretty picture, but a structured chain that relies on facts and allows something to be tested. When someone declares, "This is from Sirius," and to the question why replies, "I got this as a revelation," he cuts it off without sentiment. That's not a theory. That's just an idea with zero evidence. Still, within the cosmic version, there remain several serious possibilities. The first is that humans are direct descendants of the gods,
that is, an extraterrestrial civilization that later degenerated. The second is hybrid. Humans were created as the result of mixing different forms of life. If we accept the first scheme, a question immediately arises. Why do we have so much in common with the animal world of Earth? Then we'd have to carry the logic further and admit that all life on Earth was seeded by the same civilization, the same genes, the same DNA, the same line of development. But the further you stretch this chain, the more it gets covered with assumptions that can no longer be tested.
That's why Sklyarov turns us back to ancient sources, where the process of creating humans is described in the most concrete way. Sumerian traditions are the only known body of texts where creation is laid out almost step by step. And it's on this basis that Sklyarov builds his reconstruction. The story begins not on Earth, but on the planet of the gods. There, a member of the royal family, who has no legal right to the throne, seizes power. After some time, supporters of the rightful monarch overthrow him. To avoid execution, the usurper is forced to flee, together with those who are loyal to him and simply cannot stay behind: courtiers, the starship crew, and a limited number of servants. This whole group heads to a planet with harsh conditions, where no one will look for them: to Earth. What follows is not a cosmic fairy tale, but a very down-to-earth problem: how to survive. They need to eat local food, arrange shelter, provide themselves with raw materials and tools. These gods are not used to hard work. Neither the crew nor the courtiers are farmers. Those who are forced to work eventually rebel. The situation becomes a dead end. The work has to be done, but there is no one willing to do it. And here, according to the Sumerian texts, a decision is made to create a new worker. They turn to a local blank, a highly organized earth creature with social bonds. Sklyarov casually calls it a talking monkey, emphasizing that it's not necessarily a Neanderthal, but some advanced being just short of human. In some way, this blank doesn't fit the plan. According to the legends, this creature refuses to work, won't obey. The new species must be obedient, but still trainable. From there, the texts move into something that looks very much like a description of a genetic experiment. They take the essence of a monkey, take the essence of this talking ape, take the essence of a god, and not just any god, but the leader of the rebellious gods, and mix them. A series of experiments follows. A whole mass of defective variants appears. Here, Sklyarov draws a direct parallel with modern genetics. We know how the story of Dolly the sheep ended: rapid aging and early death. Genetic institutes have produced monstrous forms: frogs with eyes on their backs, extra legs. The typical result of interspecies crossing is beings that cannot reproduce. And the Sumerian texts describe a familiar picture. In one case, the urine would not hold. In another, there were physical defects. In another, the being could not speak at all. In the end, they managed to get a variant that meets the requirements. It can work, can be trained, and can live in local conditions. But the process doesn't end there. What we today would call artificial insemination and surrogacy comes into play. The texts describe it this way: they summon about 10 goddesses, prepare several fertilized eggs, place them into the bodies of these goddesses, and they carry the future humans to term. If you try to put yourself in the place of an ancient priest, a natural question arises. Where could such descriptions have even come from? Sklyarov asks the same thing. How did the texts of peoples who lived thousands of years ago end up with scenes that strongly echo modern genetic experiments? The legends answer unambiguously. The gods themselves told them about it. That, in their words, is how they explained to humans how they had created their ancestors. And this is where those same oddities in our DNA come back. We've already heard about mitochondrial-Eve and about regions of the genome whose functions are unclear and unlike anything we see in animals. Sklyarov emphasizes an important point. We see the fact of a mutation, but we cannot determine the cause, natural or artificial. From the trace in the genes, you cannot tell whether it was a random jump or someone's experiment. In exactly the same way, today's genetic experiments will leave behind altered animals and plants. And thousands of years from now, no one will be able to tell just from the DNA where those changes came from. In the end, a construction emerges that is hard to simply wave away. On one hand, evolution exists. We can trace it. On the other, within this evolution, there could have been external interference. And in the Sumerian myths, in Sklyarov view, we are not just seeing the fantasies of an ancient people, but a plausible scenario of what that interference might have looked like in reality.
Now let's look not at humans, but at those whom the Sumerians called gods. If they were real beings, they must have had their own planet and their own biology. Sklyarov stresses, naming a specific star is pointless, but from indirect clues we can imagine the conditions in which they lived. The starting point is the theme of blue blood. He reminds us, octopuses have blue blood, blood based not on iron, but on copper. Instead of hemoglobin, they have hemocyanin. With that kind of blood, the organism's biochemistry changes, and some oddities in the god's behavior start to look logical. First, the link to agriculture. If the gods have copper-based, not iron-based blood, they need a special diet tuned to that metabolism. He puts it this way. The gods needed plants rich in copper and poor in iron. Grains are exactly what gives that profile. Then it becomes clearer why humans are put on grain farming, and why, in the myths, working the land becomes a central task. Second, the motif of constant drinking. In the texts, the gods are always feasting, drinking. Around them is wine, beer, all sorts of drinks. If we remember hemocyanin, another link appears. Hemocyanin is worse at removing excess carbon dioxide, and light alcoholic drinks help normalize the blood's acid-base balance, the researcher explains. So even this image can be tied to biochemistry and the conditions of their home world. He stresses, this is not fiction invented for a pretty story, but logical extrapolation from what we already know about copper-based blood. Blood composition sets the diet, the habits, and those habits later become mythological motifs. From here, the cosmic version intersects with religion. If you look closely at the ancient texts, God often appears there as a party to a contract. This is especially clear in the Old Testament. It spells out in detail what sacrifices to bring, when and on what occasions, and what obligations people have. In return, God promises protection, to not let them be wronged, to help, to guard his people. For Sklyarov, this is not just a mystical image, but a very concrete scheme of interaction. These are relations between humans and representatives of another civilization. This is not religion in our modern sense, but the observance of obligations and work, a kind of corvée labor owed to God. From this grows the role of the priests. The priestly clan are those who had the right to communicate directly with the gods and served them. They organized the service, monitored compliance with the terms of the contract, performed rituals, and controlled access to the higher beings. And the temple immediately looks different. For an ancient person, a temple is not just a beautiful building, but the house of God, the place of his real presence. Priests there not only conduct rites for the people, they serve the master of the house himself. And when that civilization, as Sklyarov shows, gave up constant presence and direct intervention, the social structure remained. Priests, rules, rituals didn't go anywhere. Today, we're used to seeing it as built on fantasies, but originally it was built on real events, he notes. A natural question arises. Does the cosmic version fall apart if you look at it through the lens of biology? Sklyarov shows that biology actually leads to the same conclusions. On our planet, there are at least two biosystems living in extreme conditions. The first is communities in methane clouds at the bottom of the ocean, where microorganisms get energy by breaking down methane. The second is communities around undersea hydrothermal vents, the so-called black smokers, living at very high temperatures, enormous pressure, and in complete absence of oxygen, where oxygen is poison. The key observation is that the worms, crabs, and other inhabitants of these zones have the same DNA system and the same set of proteins that we do. In other words, under completely different, almost incompatible conditions, the genetic foundation is the same. From this, Sklyarov draws two possible conclusions. Either life in the universe develops according to common laws of matter's self-organization and tends towards similar forms, meaning life similar to ours can easily arise on another planet, or all of this has common roots.
He adds one more detail to the picture. Today, complex organic compounds are being discovered in space on the scale of entire galaxies. Organic matter can form from inorganic matter in space. They detect compounds with nitrogen, not just simple hydrocarbons, the researcher reminds us. So the basic kitchen for life is scattered throughout the universe, and Earth is no exception. Against this backdrop, cosmism stops looking like something crazy. The problem, as Sklyarov emphasizes, is not that the version of extraterrestrial intervention is too bold, but in our pride. It's hard for people to give up the idea of their own uniqueness. We've already gone from being the center of the universe to a small planet on the outskirts of a galaxy. First, Earth stopped being the center of the cosmos. Then the sun stopped being the axis of the world. Now it's the turn of our ideas about where we came from. The researcher states his position directly. First, he doesn't hide it. Yes, I am a supporter of the cosmic version. Second, he believes that the Sumerian scenario currently aligns better than others with the body of facts we have. What the ancient Sumerians describe is the most probable version in terms of agreement with the data. It fits the observations we know better than the others. At the same time, he stays within a scientific approach. Any theory is a model, an attempt to explain the known facts. As data accumulate, some models disappear, others take their place. If facts appear that don't fit the Sumerian scenario, we'll have to build a new model. There's nothing scary about that. One model is eventually replaced by another, he stresses. Which means that even within the cosmic version, the question of who exactly stood behind our ancestors remains open, and what happens next will depend on what new data we can obtain. He adds one more detail to the picture. Today, complex organic compounds are being discovered in space on the scale of entire galaxies. Organic matter can form from inorganic matter in space. They detect compounds with nitrogen, not just simple hydrocarbons, the researcher reminds us.
So the basic kitchen for life is scattered throughout the universe, and Earth is no exception. Against this backdrop, cosmism stops looking like something crazy. The problem, as Sklyarov emphasizes, is not that the version of extraterrestrial intervention is too bold, but in our pride. It's hard for people to give up the idea of their own uniqueness. We've already gone from being the center of the universe to a small planet on the outskirts of a galaxy. First, Earth stopped being the center of the cosmos. Then the sun stopped being the axis of the world. Now it's the turn of our ideas about where we came from. The researcher states his position directly. First, he doesn't hide it. Yes, I am a supporter of the cosmic version. Second, he believes that the Sumerian scenario currently aligns better than others with the body of facts we have. What the ancient Sumerians describe is the most probable version in terms of agreement with the data. It fits the observations we know better than the others. At the same time, he stays within a scientific approach. Any theory is a model, an attempt to explain the known facts. As data accumulate, some models disappear, others take their place. If facts appear that don't fit the Sumerian scenario, we'll have to build a new model. There's nothing scary about that. One model is eventually replaced by another, he stresses. Which means that even within the cosmic version, the question of who exactly stood behind our ancestors remains open, and what happens next will depend on what new data we can obtain.
Here he draws a very hard line as a scientist. He considers himself a man of science. Nothing here is accepted on faith. You have to see it with your own eyes and verify it. And he formulates a principle without which the entire discussion of human origins loses meaning. The engine of scientific knowledge is doubt. Doubt in everything, even in your own point of view. So even the version that seems most convincing to him remains a model, not a dogma. In the finale, the host brings us back to a broader horizon. She calls the question of where humans came from eternal and truly cosmic. Existing theories often contradict one another, and none gives a 100% proven answer to how the first human appeared on Earth. It's possible, she says, that the answer was known to ancient, highly developed civilizations that inhabited the planet many thousands of years ago, but with their disappearance, that knowledge was lost. And yet, something is slowly returning. As technology develops and our capabilities expand, ancient teachings, texts, and legends really are opening up to the modern world. The host carefully formulates a hope. One day, we will be able to learn more of the truth about our real ancestors. But for now, this is not a final full stop. It's an open question, ending with an ellipsis. Dear friends, which theory of human origins do you personally find the most convincing? And how do you feel in general about Andrey Sklyarov and his research? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we don't lose each other. See you again very soon.